Good afternoon. I'm very flattered to introduce Professor Keith Davies. Professor Keith Davies is Professor of Motor Learning at Sheffield Hallam University, namely at the Sport and Human Performance Research Group. Professor Davies is a key scientist on sport sciences, and his focus on sport skills and expertise links biomechanics, neurophysiology, psychology, sociology, and pedagogy in a truly transdisciplinary search for understanding sport behavior and performance environments in a theoretical framework designated Ecological Dynamics. He was, if not the first, among the first researchers using terms in sports sciences that are nowadays common, such as constraints, dynamics, self-organization, variability as a key property of movement, representative design, nonlinearity, indeterminacy of behavior, ecological information, and all concepts that renew our understanding of goal-directed behavior in sport. He published extensively high-quality papers across a career with over 35 years, a career which is rich in collaborations literally all over the world, inclusively Portugal. From 1997 onwards, he has been co-supervising over 12 PhD programs in Portugal, co-authoring over 100 research papers, and in the last decades, he was consultant of CPER, the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Human Performance, and also being a mentor and a key reference for our work, at least for my work. We deeply appreciate your expert collaboration, your engagement, and above all, your friendship, Keith. Thank you for the honor of being with us, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Duarte, and good afternoon to colleagues in Portugal and elsewhere tuning in. It's an absolute privilege to present at this conference. I consider Portugal as a global hub of work in skill acquisition, talent development, expertise, different areas of sports science, and it's been instrumental really in helping me with my research, particularly the application. And I'm, I think at this stage of my career, I'm more interested in applications than ever. And it's interesting that I'm based at Sheffield Hallam University in a part-time role, and Sheffield has very specific aims and captured by mission statements and visions. I love the statement of seeking to transform lives, and that is by trying to continually improve the experiences, the quality of the experiences of people, whether it's in medicine, in health, in education, in sport, of course, an area that's very rich and popular in terms of recreation, but also in terms of performance as well as a profession. My university's goal is to seek to transform lives, and we interpret that in our group as seeking to always improve the preparation for performance in sport and also the development of athletes from childhood right the way through, including aging athletes as well, athletes at different ability levels. The vision is of Sheffield Hallam is to be the best applied university in the world. So we're constantly seeking to apply the work. And one thing I want to talk about today is an issue that has caught our group's attention more and more. And that is this, the issue of specificity and generality of practice, learning, training in sport, and really trying to understand it better. Now, everybody knows, and it's very hard to deny, that specificity is an important principle in learning, in practice, and in training. And it's well known in physiology, it's well known in psychology, it's well known in movement science, sports science. But the argument I'm going to make today is that it probably has been too domineering. It's dominated things too much, and we need to get a much more nuanced understanding. And I'm proposing that we should look at skill acquisition and athlete development, team development in different sports as enrichment, a process of enrichment that can be very, very specific, or it can be very general. So there's a timing issue. That's what I'm going to try to, a main message I'm going to try to get across in the presentation today. So let me just move this on. How do I just... There we are. Enrichment of the environment is becoming very popular in a lot of different areas of research. So you have it in for example, you have it in animal research here, where, for example, there are people who are interested in organizing environments, designing environments for animals. If they're, if for example, in a zoo, they're in a kind of a in terms of farming and stuff like that. The idea of not just keeping them in cages, but also, but think about enriching their environments so that they are psychologically and emotionally engaged with their environment still. And there's some of this research in environmental enrichment in zoology, for example, is being transferred to the study of disease and illness in human individuals. And the idea being that rehabilitation processes for stroke patients, for example, may benefit from more of a functional approach to enriching the environment so that stroke patients are challenged to step, to balance, to turn, to move in very safe environments, of course, but not just to stand or sit and just repeat strengthening exercises. Now, in many different areas of research, enrichment has either a different theoretical approach. So, for example, here, the theoretical approach in the enrichment of animal studies and in stroke patients, the theoretical approach is to consider how that the connections between parts of the central nervous system and the brain can be integrated and maintained. It's more of a sort of the explanation, if you like, for the enrichment process is considered at that level of analysis. But there's other ways of looking at enrichment as well. And a colleague of mine, and Duarte's as well, Carl Woods, really excellent young researcher based at Victoria University. He sent me a paper literally this morning, and I was quickly looked through it, and I saw some interesting data. So what you're looking at there is it's a statistical analysis by researchers, and they were interested in the academic background of Nobel Prize laureates. In other words, people who've reached the pinnacles of their career. And in this case here, we're talking about the medical sciences. And as you look at the screen, the figure on the left is the range of undergraduate courses that medical Nobel laureates across the world, that's what they took as part of their development. And on the right-hand side, you see that this is what they tended to do for their PhD. If you look at the blue part of the figure, what you see there is 31%, that's just 1/3 of Nobel laureates in medicine, actually specifically studied medicine at an early stage of their development. Only 54% of them did a PhD specifically in medicine. And so there's some interesting ideas here to explore. And that is that there could be something else about the sort of more general broad background of their development, which led them towards this process of seeking to become much more skilled and much more expert in a particular area of medical sciences. So it does raise a question about the idea that if you want to succeed at a high level in a particular area or a profession, such as medical sciences, sport, education, health perhaps, you don't have to start specializing too early. In fact, you can see that the most successful people tended to have more of a broad background or came from a broad background and specialized later. So we go back to that issue of timing, understanding when people can specialize in a particular area and what it is that that might contribute to a sort of a broader, more varied background that enriches them when it so that it prepares them, it empowers them for becoming an expert in the medical sciences. Now, this type of analysis of enrichment is more based on statistical data and analysis of big data, looking for patterns, etc. So we are really in need of a theory to explain what's going on, and so that applied practitioners in sport, in health, and education can actually use processes of enrichment in a very confident way, because they understand what they're trying to achieve, because it's based on a theoretical approach. So it does raise questions. Why, in terms of the Sports Science Congress, it's very relevant to think about, why hasn't sports science paid enough attention to athlete enrichment? I'm sure that there are individuals that can claim that they have, and that there are certain pockets of research that draw attention to athlete enrichment. And it's worth looking at a broad historical analysis to understand why perhaps we focus too much on specificity and not a better balance with generality of practice. So when I talk about enrichment, I talk about having a broad, varied range of experiences which prepare you to specialize at a later date. And rather than just focusing on specializing from, maybe being identified or spotted early on as a talent, and then from a very young age, just focusing on your progress in terms of skills and expertise in one area. We're talking about having a broader base, a broader foundation, and then at the right moment to specialize. So what is it about sports science and the theories that inform sports science that has kind of neglected to look at athlete enrichment as a viable process for developing the next generation of athletes? So we start with some background here. So in science, it's very popular to have dualisms, and in psychology, for example, where we study expertise and skill, there's a tradition of it. Dualisms have been very popular in psychology. And here's some examples of dualisms that you will have come across. And the problem with having these dualisms is that certain topics of study, which are important, have been counterpositioned against each other. In other words, researchers have chosen to look at one way of, for example, practicing a highly specific way or a structured way versus another way, rather than looking at, if you like, the complementarity that may exist between the different approaches to practice, learning, training, for example, in sport. So when we go to sports science, then specificity versus generality of practice as an idea, as a topic of study, has a history. And historically, this is how a lot of early motor learning research started. Here's the title of Franklin Henry's address to a 1958 meeting of the College of Physical Education: Specificity versus Generality in Learning Motor Skills. Now, Franklin Henry, an absolute giant in the area of motor learning, very talented man, had good technological engineering skills, worked in PE, physical education, worked very hard to take an evidence-based approach to physical education. And the topic at that time, when he was working in the prime of his research career, was really this notion of, I suppose it boiled down to this question: can we identify individuals to who can become the next best footballers or climbers or swimmers or athletes, or can we actually prepare them? Can we practice, help them to practice and train so that they develop those skills and specialize in one of those domains? And that was part of the dualism, if you like, and that became part of the debate in motor learning: specificity versus generality. And when you look at the titles of the research papers, here's a few, you can see that it really was a thing. In the last decades of the last century, for example, a lot of the titles were looking at the counter positioning, and it was all based on this notion of really trying to understand whether it would be a good idea to try to develop tests and assessments that could help us to predict whether an individual is likely to become a good team games player or a good climber or a swimmer, or whether we can develop training methods and practice methods that can help those individuals to become those specialist athletes. And so the argument I'm making is that when you take a debate approach, when you counterposition, when you use the versus idea, one approach versus another, you perhaps miss out on an opportunity to examine their complementarity. In other words, the value of both approaches, in this case, specificity and generality of practice, training and learning, together, and understanding how they may complement each other, when they can be used in individuals in their development, and how they can be used. As Duarte mentioned at the beginning of the introduction, ecological dynamics is the area of work that I'm particularly fascinated in and develop. And this, essentially, it looks at the relationship between an individual and the environment, and it really does pay attention to the relationship of an individual with an environment. And so for me, ecological dynamics is a natural framework to look at athlete enrichment, to look at how we can investigate the complementarity of general practice, more varied practice, practice in multiple activities in different sports, versus specificity of practice, specialising in a particular approach. Here you've got a constraints model, as Duarte mentioned before. It's a model of practice and learning design that I've been fascinated about over many, many years. And that, for those of you who don't know, very quickly, very briefly, the notion is that individuals have specific constraints or characteristics or properties that can predispose them towards engaging with the environment in different ways. That's what gives us our individuality, if you like. We engage in tasks with specific constraints, and those constraints, those things that shape our behavior, shape the way we engage with a task. They could be, they're listed here, for example. And then you have environmental constraints, which can be physical or social in nature. And these three categories of constraints, according to Carl Newell, the author of the constraints-based approach, interact together to enhance the way that we engage. Each individual engages with the environment, whether it's everyday life environment or whether it's a performance environment in sport, for example. And the ecological dynamics focuses on this particular relationship, the relationship between information and movement. We need information to regulate our actions, our movements, and our movements then provide us with more information. And as we become more skillful, as we become more really engaged with the environment, being able to interact, that information movement coupling or movement information coupling becomes tighter and tighter. And it provides us with functional movement solutions, which means essentially that we can find a movement solution for dynamic, ever changing task environments, whether the changes are very, very small, for example, or whether they're very, very big and dynamic. So whether you're performing in a more stable task environment or more dynamic task environment, this model can explain performance. So information is what we need. So the information that a coach or sports scientist designs into a practice task can be used by an athlete to regulate their movement. So that's quite an important principle when we think about practice design. And what that information movement coupling does, it allows us to use affordances of the environment, which is, as James Gibson mentioned, there are opportunities or invitations for action. And we're surrounded by affordances. Any environment that you engage with in different sports, you have quite specific affordances. In fact, you have a landscape of affordances. And it's the ability to use affordances of the environment that gives people expertise and skill. So from the topic, the process, the idea of enrichment, topic of enrichment in relation to skill adaptation, the idea is that individuals who are exposed to a wide range of information and affordances can regulate their actions and adapt their skills to the changing environment as they need. And that means providing individuals with a diversified range of movement experiences, particularly early in learning, but even in later in learning. So it means that even during the specialisation phase, when highly specific practice tasks are designed, there could be a certain amount of variability which can challenge learners to discover and explore affordances of the performance environment, whether that performance environment was a football game or a team game like basketball or volleyball, or whether it was climbing context, as an indoor climbing wall or an outdoor hillside or mountainside, or a pool, whether that pool is indoors with all the constraints of an indoor swimming pool, or it's outdoors in wild water swimming. So affordance landscapes then can be, they're obviously very useful for sports scientists and coaches to design, and they can be more specialised and they can be more general. So here's a continuum capturing the affordances of particular practice environments, training environments, and that continuum goes from the very highly structured, isolated type of practice environments where you get direct teaching and instructing, highly specialised, and then you've got more rich and varied affordance landscapes or opportunities to use different aspects of the environment in order to achieve task goals at this end. Somewhere along here, an individual athlete can be located at a particular time by coaches, by sports scientists, depending on their needs. So sometimes they will need to be engaged in specialised, highly specific training to use very specific affordances, opportunities or invitations to interact with the environment, as we note up here. And at other times, at this end, the learning and practice environment should be rich, replete with many varied opportunities to interact with the environment. So it's not a question of thinking that one end is very, very good, one end is very, very bad. It's about understanding the timing and the needs for each individual athlete, where they should be at a particular moment. Now, it's true as well that certain pedagogical approaches, such as non-linear pedagogy, constraints-based coaching, athletic skills model, a way of developing talented athletes, they tend to be located towards the more varied end, but not completely at the varied end. I mean, they tend to explore, they advocate exploration down here, but clearly sometimes constraints of a task need to be very stable, very focused. There can be a little bit of variability, but not as much as down at this end here. And so from an enrichment perspective, what that means is that when you use multiple, the experiences, you expose an athlete to the experiences of multiple sports and activities, they can be located down at this end here to use many, many different affordances. And then during specialisation, a lot of the work needs to be moved down to this end here in a more structured way, but one that is not completely devoid of any variability and dynamicism at all. It shouldn't really engage in too much repetition and rehearsal and orchestration of movements. It's much more about exploration in a narrow affordance landscape versus exploration in a much broader affordance landscape. When does each individual athlete need that? How long for? And what about the timing of that enrichment process is a question that I think is prominent in ecological dynamics. So enrichment from an ecological dynamics perspective is very much about exploring the affordance landscape, helping athletes to explore different parts of or different fields of the affordance landscape, some that are more specialised, some that are more general. And so James Gibson's idea, let's go back to the information action or information movement coupling idea. Here you have another continuum, and at one end you have very highly specifying information. So that is information that you use to regulate your actions in particular performance environments. for example, in a springboard diving environment, in an ice climbing environment, in a cricket environment, team games environment. There's a lot of specificity in terms of the information that's used to regulate your actions. So the more specifying information helps you to regulate your actions in a much more functional way. So if you are really looking at particular specific practice task design, in ecological dynamics, this is called representative design. The information that you face in competition should be located in the practice task so that the athlete learns to engage with those particular sources. At the other end, that doesn't mean that non-specifying information, i.e. the more general activities, is completely useless. It may be less useful, and if you spend all your time practicing at this end of this continuum, then it's unlikely that you will succeed at the highest level. But there's certainly some value from the point of view of enrichment for being at this end of the continuum at times, maybe early in your career for a time so that you can become a better athlete, much more rounded. You engage in lots of different experiences. But some of these designs here will not be useful to athletes from an ecological perspective, because you do need to include relevant actions. You do need to include opportunities to perceive information and act and perceive information. You do need to challenge athletes to use their cognitive system to function. In other words, to make decisions, to solve problems. All of that needs to be integrated into a task that has some sort of specificity depending on where you are. So to clarify, if you just climbed on an indoor climbing wall, you could become really skillful at this, but you will need to engage with a specific climbing area, like an ice climbing, an ice fall, a frozen waterfall, in order to become specialised in climbing in those environments. There are some skills and processes which will transfer to this, but you can complement indoor practice with outdoor practice, but that needs to be understood in a very, very nuanced way. Okay, let's just focus on applied sports science then. What have applied sports scientists, how have they dealt with this notion of enrichment and this notion of integrating specificity of practice and generality of practice? Anatoly Bondarchuk, a Russian sports scientist, he talked about the unity of specificity and generality of practice. He focused on, he argued that there were some very good reasons to include general physical practice in athlete preparation and development, and obviously specialised or specific physical practice needed to be undertaken as well. And he defined those in quite in an operational way, I guess. He didn't have a theoretical framework to underpin it, but his ideas really do align well with the ideas from ecological dynamics about enrichment. He argued that it was good to use a mix of general physical practice or general physical preparation and specific physical preparation in training designs. And he developed a continuum from more general early on until you, as you approach competition and as you developed your expertise and skill level, then you needed to become much more specialist, and the practice activities need to resemble or represent those that you face in competition. And these ideas link very closely to the athletic skills model continuum, as I will show you next. An important point to note from an ecological perspective is that essentially these ideas do relate to representative learning design. And the message there is that sports scientists, when you want athletes, when you are working with athletes to develop highly specialized specific skills, then you need to design more representative environments, i.e. practice environments that take information, relevant information sources from the competition environment and try to simulate them in the practice environment. And I think that probably was quite exemplified quite well when you look at the Euros, the recent Euros football tournament, and the number of teams that when they failed at penalty shootouts, it's quite possible that some of the athletes may have needed much more specific experience and practice and expertise of performing a penalty in a competition environment. And a real challenge for football coaches is, how do you create that pressure, that competition? How do you make practice of football penalty kicking much more representative of a competitive environment when there are 60,000 people present in a stadium, plus also millions watching on television? It's very hard to do, but it's part of that specificity enrichment process that we challenge that we talked about. So Bondarchuk then talked about this continuum. So at one end, athletes need to engage in much more general exercises and activities and sports. They start to become much more specific and special in terms of the way that they prepare individuals to specialize at a later phase. And then the ultimate aim, according to Bondarchuk, is to prepare an athlete to succeed in competitive environments. And as I mentioned before, representative learning design is a way of making training designs much more specific, much more representative of competition as you move along the developmental process. The athletic skills model has a continuum, and they focus very neatly on recommending lots of multi-sport activities, engaging in lots of different sports, becoming a little bit more focused towards the specialized sport, and then practicing so-called donor sports. These are sports that develop you specifically for performance in at the specialized end. And at the specialized end, this is where the idea of adaptive sport. Adaptive means that even your technical training, even the specific training, must include variability and challenges, rather than focused on too much on repetition and rehearsal. That's not what specificity means. It means much more about the challenges and the variability being much more focused on a particular environmental relationship or context. Eventually then, sport specific means competition specific at that end. So there is a continuum that an athlete moves down as they become more specialized. These experiences are highly important for an athlete because they provide them with a rich foundation which they can exploit and can empower them in order to succeed in specific sports at a later stage. They need to be very well considered, particularly the donor sports. And here's an example of where multi-sports and donor sports activities can be practiced in the athletic skills model. Obviously, it's a football-related example, and there are lots of varied activities here that can help that can challenge an individual and help them to solve movement problems in lots of different ways using perception, action, and cognition. And so, specificity of practice and generality of practice from an ecological dynamics theoretical approach results in different types of skill adaptation unless they are complemented together. That's the point of this slide here. Essentially, the ideas of Nikolai Bernstein, led us to understand that as you learn, one of the important things about Bernstein's work in motor skills, is that essentially he refocused the area's emphasis away from motor control and more on coordination, understanding coordination and how individuals can exploit self-organization processes that are inherent in movement systems, and the idea of that you can exploit self-organization to, if you like, exploit movement synergies that are coordination that are formed. They can be task specific and sometimes not, according to Bernstein. The non-specific task synergies or coordinations that are formed are not useless. They provide you with that general foundation and help you to adapt your skills. They help you to, if you like, function in a dynamic environment when you need to. They also help you to stabilize your movements in lots of different ways. So this is, I think I like this diagram because it shows you that, for example, if you see the individual learner as a ball transiting across a landscape, a performance landscape here, you can see that if that individual engages in too much specificity of practice, highly specialized practice and training from a very, very early age, the landscape that they develop and have to encounter is very rigid and quite narrow. So you have a lot of stability in these wells here, in these deep regions, but in order to then transit and adapt the movement, it takes a lot of power and effort and energy to move the system from one part to another. Instead, there are areas of the landscape that can be specific and that can provide stability, but you don't really want the areas to provide too much stability like this here, this type of landscape. The landscape should be much more undulating, and it should require less effort in order to find stability, but also to adapt the movement skills. So skill adaptation from an ecological perspective, basically, essentially, would produce a landscape like this from a metaphoric reasoning. And so according to Bernstein's insights then, a rich mix of specificity of practice and generality of practice would provide a landscape that was undulating, provided stability at times, but also allowed an individual to produce a dynamic performance that allowed them to adapt to the environment. Now, this diagram I adapted from a paper that I read actually as a young motor learning student back in the day, Higgins and Spaeth. I've liked this diagram for many years. I liked it back then and I like it now. And I have taken the liberty of adapting the figure because I think it has some value for us to understand the complementarity, the nuanced relationship that needs to exist between specialisation and diversification of movement skills in a child's development through youth into adulthood and into even later adulthood. Now, the reason why I like this, I'm interpreting this from my own perspective, an ecological perspective, is essentially that both, depending on the task that you're performing, regardless of it, in fact, and if you want to specialize in a particular sport or context, there's still a need for a broad foundation early in practice. So this represents the breadth of the activities that you undertake, and then you specialize later on. So you can see the trajectory and the narrowing. That's important. Whether that's too narrow or not, maybe from an ecological dynamics perspective, even if you, in tasks, as Carl Newell argues down here in this quote, in some tasks where you really do have to use quite specific movement patterns, movement kinematics to achieve a task goal, for example, in particular dancing activities, figure skating, gymnastics activities, there is still some variability needed and adapting to different environments, adapting to different properties of the ice, for example, in figure skating, adapting to slight variations in the sequence of movements in dance or in gymnastics. But generally, you have this broad foundation here, and then a narrowing and specializing later on in practice. In other activities, you still need the broad foundation early on, but you can see that can allow you then to specialize in different areas, or even in the same sport, different roles and different conditions. So for example, if you're playing tennis, you can undergo a rich, broad variety of experiences, as a lot of the top tennis players have, particularly people like Djokovic, for example. But you can specialize on clay, on grass, and other areas. And it's the same with, if you're a team games player, you can specialize within a sport in a different role. But even between sports, you can decide that you can, you're a good athlete, you can perform well in one team game or even in another one as well. So there's more variability here later on in practice. But you can see that both focus on the rich, broad, the breadth of movement experiences that are needed in order to achieve either the goal of specialisation or diversification later on. And so I'd like to come to the end of the presentation by suggesting a few take-home messages from the perspective of applied sports science and coaching. So I think that one thing that applied sports scientists could take on board is that recognizing that specificity of practice, training, learning is important. That's a given, an important principle in sports science, but there needs to be a better balance between specificity and generality of sports experiences. And that will help us to overcome some of the problems of early specialisation, over specialisation. I'm talking about physical problems, emotional, psychological problems, and too much repetition and rehearsal of movements. And I think that we need a theoretical framework like ecological dynamics that can help to explain why we need that complementarity of specificity and generality. And athlete enrichment is one way that ecological dynamics can help us to understand this type of the need for this complementarity. So in other words, what it means is that practice and training and the development for each individual can be more specific and more general, even when they're at expert levels. There are times when they can experience more general movement activities and experiences. For example, when they're recovering from injury, if they're trying to overcome a movement deficit, if the athleticism of an individual is compromised, for example. But this relationship between specificity and generality is quite individualized, and it's based on time as well for each individual. So there's no formula that we should follow, in my opinion. It should be very taken an individualized approach, and it should be informed by science, by theory, like ecological dynamics, by data, as we saw before, when we talked about the Nobel laureates in medicine, but equally by the practice experience of coaches and trainers. So it's really about those individuals complementing and adding to what we know about the athlete enrichment process. And that will help us to understand how do we individualize training. That's, I think, it's a real key area that sports scientists need to study much more. And if there are any PhD students are out there looking for a topic, I think this would be a very useful area to look at. From an ecological perspective, the individualization occurs as an individual moves down different parts of the affordance landscape and explores and searches different fields, but it is quite important. The athletic skills model focuses on training athletes first and then specialists later. I think that's a good, a wise statement, and there's theory and evidence showing that of the value of that. It means that some athletes, they can engage in a particular sport or physical activity, of course, as part of their multi-sport activity, but not to just try to identify a 5-year-old child as a future basketball player or a future volleyball player or a climber, but allow them to experience lots of different multiple sports experiences so that they can develop their athleticism, enrich their athleticism first, and then they can specialize later. Some enrichment programs should be avoided, and there are many out there. There's a multi-billion-dollar industry that our group have written about, claiming to train parts, decomposed parts of the athlete, the nervous system, the perceptual system. For me, from an ecological dynamics perspective, these enrichment programs, you can't just take out a subsystem and then polish it and put it back into the whole integrated system and then it will function well. A good enrichment program should really consider actions, perception, cognition, even the emotions, as I said before, training should be very rich and diverse and individualized for each person. And finally, these sorts of process training systems may be useful in a limited way, but they should really be embedded and used in a complementary way with practice on the field and on the playing area or in the practice environment, so that they allow athletes to engage cognitive systems, perceptual systems, and action systems in a deeply integrated way. That's what ecological dynamics means by athlete enrichment. So Duarte, I'll stop there, and maybe we can have a discussion and comment if you like now.
Thank you very much, Keith. I'm using the reaction button to express my applause for your very delightful talk. I would like to just do a brief comment in the question, and meanwhile I ask all the participants to place the questions using the chat, and then I will present them to you and we will discuss. Yeah. It was a very rich presentation, Keith, as you always do. Some new concepts that I was not aware. For example, this idea of ecological view of enrichment. And anyway, I would like to emphasize your concern that this idea of one thing or the other is maybe an easy way to discuss, but not correspondent with reality. There's not such a thing as only specificity or only generality. We should take a look at this phenomenon as with a much broader look, and to see how the things can be complemented. And I think this is a very rich and very powerful message, and somehow it reunites trends that tend to be apart, but they have interesting knowledge to be shared and to be complemented. So I think this was a very impactful question that you made. I was very interested and intrigued somehow with the word enrichment, and I'd like to say why I felt this. Well, I fully understand how you place it, and you place it as the enrichment of experiences. That there are some experiences, some activities that the players can do that will increase the way they can cope with specific or with general environments. So it's not a question of simply gaining something to be more rich, but to have an experience. And I think this is a very interesting and thoughtful concept. But my question is more, this term enrichment is very much aligned with possession, with having things, with giving to the athlete what he needs to be better. And I think this is a little bit contrary to what you are saying. You are not saying to give things to the athlete, enrichment of the athlete, but you are really focusing on the interaction, on the experiences. Yes. So, yeah, don't you think that this, using the term athlete enrichment, can point towards the idea of possession, of things that make the athlete better? How do you like to put it? Yeah.
I think that's a good point, and you know, it's good to obtain that clarity. As you know, we adhere to an ecological perspective, and an ecological perspective is not just a very sort of a general statement about, oh yeah, we also we need to include the environment and the athlete. It does adhere to certain principles and certain beliefs, and if you like, philosophical ideas. And they're sometimes they're hard to explain, and sometimes you can easily get it wrong. And so this notion of an individual embedded in the environment and interacting with the environment, and I use that term specifically, interacting, because it you know, you can sometimes act and you can sometimes react, but interacting is where you're deeply embedded with the environment, particularly the information that's present in the environment. So that information movement relationship, and that the ability of an individual to regulate their actions with information and then to act in order to pick up information, that really shows, for me, provides a lens to focus on enrichment. It's not, you're absolutely right. We're not talking about the programs that you can buy off the shelf, like a VR system or a brain training device, and then it's a gift to the athlete and that can enrich them. It's really about an ecological perspective, which basically says that the most important thing is the information movement relationship. And that is what somebody should focus on when it comes to, people should focus on when it comes to thinking about athlete enrichment. That focus very much on that relationship between an individual and the environment, particularly the information that's present and the movement, movements that are available, that can be explored and searched by an individual.
Oh, very interesting. Thank you, Keith. We have some questions. I would like to place them to you. One is from José Praia. Thank you for your question, and he's highlighting the fact that you are bringing Bernstein to applied coaching. And he asks, do you agree that Bernstein's advice was underestimated regarding the actual athletics learning system, which do not use fullness degrees of freedom at movement speed capacity? I think, yeah.
I mean, my feeling is that we must remember, I think that's a very good point. There's an underlying point there in that question, and that is that when we refer to the insights and the words of someone who wrote a book in the Russian language in the 1930s, we have to be careful. And it was like, I felt when I prepared this presentation, I felt a little bit uncertain about referring to the Higgins and Spaeth diagram, because I kind of like hijacked that diagram, if you like, and I've interpreted it from my perspective. Some of their insights are aligned with the ecological perspective, others are not. And the way that I explained that, so this is where we can refer to the Bernstein idea, is not all Bernstein's insights are aligned with an ecological perspective. And, we do take some and we sort of use them to support an ecological dynamics rationale. They fit quite well with that. But yeah, you're right. I think that some aspects of an individual, what they've written, may not align with a completely modern, contemporary ecological dynamics approach, but we can't blame that individual, because, could you imagine the sort of quality of the insights that Bernstein would have produced if he was, working with dynamicists, working with ecological psychologists, working with applied sports scientists that were trying to look at these ideas in detail. So it is a tricky task, and we have to be careful about it. So I don't want to give the impression that we should take every insight produced by Bernstein, and to be honest, Gibson as well. Let's be honest about that. I'd take that at face value and integrate it into an ecological dynamics rationale. Really, ecological dynamics. The reason that some people like it, some don't, it's a kind of a framework, a broad framework, and it has insights from different areas to enrich it. So
sure.
I think that's my comment on that question.
Very interesting. Indeed, I think there is, there's lots of merits to write, as he did in the 30s, on such a clarity about human movement. And also, I think he somehow can help in this link between specificity and generality. For example, in his levels of construction of movement, the generality that is more directed towards the tonus or toward the action, and then the space being more ecologically oriented. So I think there's also very good value. But as you said, it's we should understand that in the light of the 30s, of the knowledge of the 30s. By the way, it was amazing to know that the colleagues of Bernstein were such names as Alexander Luria and Vygotsky. They were the three people who discussed together during those times, developing such a wonderful theories in neuroscience, in social psychology, and human movement as the three did.
Their contributions, they've the phrase standing on the shoulders of giants. Their contributions to science have been fantastic in psychology, movement science, and can be applied in some areas, to sports science.
Yeah, completely. There is Bruno Travassos also asking you a question. And he said, do you think that the individual enrichment should be less representative and more general than the groupal or the collective training?
Yeah, that's a good question. Hi, Bruno. It's a good question, a thoughtful question. This is what makes coaching very hard. I think enrichment should be considered at an individual level, but obviously it doesn't mean that every individual is completely unique. There are some similarities between individuals, but there are also some individualities. I think at times in education and in health and in coaching, for example, in pedagogy, we do take too much of a group-based approach. By that I mean a one-size-fits-all approach, and try to treat problems and challenges and individuals in groups and try to consider things from a collective perspective. There is some merit in that, but I think a much more valuable approach would be to take an individualized approach and really in order to help coaches and sports scientists with that process in sport. I think that our group's emphasis on co-design is important. Again, this was a contribution from people like Carl Woods and Mark O'Sullivan and James Rudd, James Vaughan, and yourself as well, Duarte. This notion of co-designing, engaging an athlete, because they know themselves very well. They understand their strengths, their weaknesses, and they want to learn, they want to improve. And so one way of individualizing sports practice in a meaningful way is through co-designing. I understand if you're a coach and you only have 1 hour a week to work with a group of 20 odd athletes, it's very hard to take an individualized approach. But you can only achieve a certain amount in those time constraints. An individualized approach will see much better learning, although there will be similarities and some slight differences between athletes.
Very nice. We still have two questions from Ana Gracinda and from João Roquete. Ana Gracinda asks, considering schools and teachers from one side and the other side, clubs and coaches, which one plays the most crucial role in enhancing broad sport skills that later can favor sport expertise?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that all teachers and coaches have an important role at different times, at different levels. I think working with young children, there are some very important tasks to achieve. For example, instilling a love of a particular sport, a love of moving, a love of being active is very important, particularly from a health perspective, a recreational perspective, but also from an elite performer perspective, because an individual's motivation to go through the hard years of training, whether it's general training or more specific training, that's quite an important thing. So what I guess maybe if we turn it on its head, at an early age, you can do a lot of damage to a child's engagement with sport by taking the wrong approach. And so by instilling a sense of fun, enjoyment, and also exposing them to lots of different experiences, you can set the child onto a path where they can have a lifelong love of being active, and that would lead them towards more of a healthier lifestyle, hopefully. But also you can set them on a path towards elite sport performance as well. So I think that it doesn't mean that elite coaches and trainers, their role is easier at all, because when individuals get to that elite level, they come and they may have certain weaknesses, and having to address those, through a program of athlete enrichment late on in a career, that's a challenge. But I think what's achieved early on, coaching and teaching in physical education with young children from very early, even parents as well, I think that's mightily important. Thank you, Anna. Question.
Very nice. We have one last question from João Roquete, and he asks, well, when you say that first the athletes and then the specialists, as the athletic skills model also indicates, is this something so this implies that we should avoid talent identification, selection, and specialization in youth sport?
Yeah, I think so. I think that I think that's a good assessment and observation to make in terms of understanding the logic of ecological dynamics. So the ecological dynamics argues that an individual is a non-linear dynamical movement system. And any non-linear system, it means that it doesn't follow a linear trajectory. And so what you see at the age of 5, 6, and there are some, you know, I'm talking about Premier League clubs having an elite under 5 squad, for example, of children identified as footballers and talented footballers, elite, and then that's it, they're on that pathway. This is what the model is. I think it's very hard to understand someone at the age of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, where they're going to end up, their trajectory. And there's lots of different reasons for that, which we've talked about, because their trajectory in terms of a developing athlete is non-linear, and there may be periods where they will they'll have some sort of regressions in performance. It might be adolescence, for example. They may have periods of stability where they plateau in performance, and they may have sudden jumps in performance as well. It's all about helping them to supporting them on that non-linear trajectory and not letting them get too carried away or not too despondent if they don't end up somewhere. But certainly I think that trying to predict by identifying a young child as a potential elite footballer or a climber or swimmer is fraught with problems because of the non-linearity of development. Good question, good comment.
Keith, time flies. It was really a pleasure to have you here, to have your very insightful talk, and also this rich discussion with among participants. And thank you very much. I will express my applause with the reaction button. So if any one of you want to also share your applause, it would be great for Keith to know that you appreciate his talk.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the invitation. Again, as I say, I'm absolutely privileged to talk because in Portugal, there are many institutions that are really at the center of leading the global understanding of, I do mean this, you know, of skill, of talent, of expertise. And, you know, I really do applaud my Portuguese colleagues and also colleagues around the globe that are helping towards that. So thank you. Thanks for the invitation, Duarte and colleagues.
You're